In the first part of this story told by Arturo Denel Paddock, you already learned the context of this confrontation. Alonso, a man who was returning to Formula 1 with a lot to prove, and Esteban Ocon, a young man willing to win at any cost to lead the team and beat a teammate for the first time. The story of this battle is divided into two seasons. The 2021 season is narrated by Arturo, who shows us the camaraderie that existed between the two, but 2022, the part we're covering, is the absolute breaking point. And as you know, Guerra en el Box is a series in collaboration with the channel En el Nel Paddock, where the first part of this story is available on our friend's channel and the second is the one you are about to watch. If you want the context before this confrontation, we suggest first visiting Arturo's channel En el Nel Paddock, then watching the story's continuation. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second part of Guerra en el Box, Fernando Alonso versus Esteban Ocon. The 2021 season left the feeling that even though Alonso finished ahead of Ocon in the drivers' standings, both of them had somehow won something. Ocon won his first Grand Prix in Hungary after a surprising race, and Alonso got back on the podium in Qatar after many years without being able to do so. However, expectations were high inside Alpine as they wanted to become a team on the rise and they had goals to fight for victories in the short to medium term. This was after returning to Formula 1 in 2016, wanting to achieve success no matter what. But in that growth, there always has to be a leader, someone who leads the team to glory. And in the particular case of Alpine, neither of them wanted to give up that throne and only one of them could lead this team. But after so many years of losing to his teammates, Esteban Ocon would take the 2022 season very personally, determined once and for all to be ahead of a teammate in the drivers' standings. Their first confrontation would be at the Bahrain Grand Prix, where they had a fairly subdued battle. Ocon ended up beating Alonso despite receiving a 5-second penalty for causing an incident with the Haas, managing to finish in 7th place while Alonso finished in 9th. However, it wouldn't take much longer in the season for things to start getting out of control in this battle. Jeddah has always been known as a circuit where, with just a little spark, things can get really ugly. The last thing a team needs is its two drivers pushing each other to the limit on a track as dangerous as the Saudi Arabian desert. But well, maybe they didn't explain that to Ocon, or he simply didn't care at all.
Both Alpines go for it. Fernando Alonso nearly hits the wall. Certainly against the wall and still behind his teammate, Esteban Ocon.
I feel that was a little bit late.
Ocon had one goal in mind, to beat his teammate and show no mercy at all. And in this Grand Prix, in these opening laps, he was defending tooth and nail against Fernando, more than any driver should defend against a teammate. Not until lap 7 did the Asturian overtake him in turn 1, and as they exited, Fernando Alonso quickly returned some of the earlier favors. Yes. But I hope by this point you didn't think that for Ocon, this would settle the matter. He would try to regain the position a lap later, but if you play aggressively with Fernando, he's going to do exactly the same. And by zigzagging on the main straight, he prevents Ocon from overtaking him, at least for the moment in this battle. These two were fighting as if they were battling for a world championship. His team wasn't particularly comfortable with it, but the party wasn't going to end with this. Ocon was going to keep trying without success to regain the position until eventually Bottas ended up overtaking him. What seemed to be a duel already won by Fernando at this particular point, but unfortunately in this Grand Prix, the particular ordeal of the two drivers would begin, who, besides battling each other, also had to fight their car's reliability issues. Since Fernando had to retire 15 laps from the end due to an engine problem, which handed the victory of this particular duel on a silver platter to Esteban Ocon, who managed to finish 6th in that race. After this fight, both calmly told the press that the battle had been fine, but overall, Alonso did not like at all the way his teammate had defended himself. But Ocon also didn't seem to want to show any willingness to change in the way he faced these battles with his teammate. and it was clear that both had somehow come out of this competition feeling relieved, but this impressive duel was only the beginning of what would quickly turn into a war between the two. But this war, apart from involving battles between these two, continued to involve the lack of reliability of that single-seater, where Alonso had to deal with it in Australia with a chance to have a strong qualifying session where his engine failed a few laps before his last attempt, which was looking quite promising. For him, the race was no different. It was a disaster, and he finished last among those who completed the Grand Prix. Things didn't improve in the next Grand Prix. In Imola, Alonso retired after a collision with Mick Schumacher, and in Miami, he failed to score points while Ocon scored again with his Alpine. And during these Grands Prix, they kept sharing victories in their personal duel, where Ocon beat him at his home race in Spain, but Fernando was able to respond in the following Grands Prix with an Ocon who was not giving in at all. The fight between the two was quite intense, and this quickly started to fire up the fans because the Spanish public criticized him for not being a good teammate, especially after what Fernando had done a year earlier to help Ocon get his first victory in the category. And every time the Frenchman spoke to the press, he said that his relationship with Alonso was very good and that there was no conflict at all, that any internal conflict was just imagined by fans and the press. But even if he tried to hide the tension between them, it was impossible to do so. After what happened at the 2022 Hungarian Grand Prix, Ocon had managed to qualify better than his teammate and would start in 5th position while Alonso was 6th in a good qualifying session for both drivers. But Ocon's ambition was to beat his teammate without conceding anything at all. And at the start of that Grand Prix, Alonso had better traction in the first few meters, but every time he tried to get alongside Ocon, the Frenchman blocked him somewhat aggressively. And later on, before the chicane on this circuit, Alonso tried to overtake him on the outside and Ocon closed the door, pushing him off the track.
Never in my life have I seen a defense like that today. Never. On the wall, 10-2, and now 10-6. Never.
Think about it. So long ways.
Let's stay focused.
No, take it. We have the race because we're big.
Let's go. Fernando Alonso didn't like Esteban Ocon's attitude at all in these first few meters of this Grand Prix, saying that in his life he had never seen such a strong defense as the one his teammate had put up against him. In a way, and fortunately for him, Fernando Alonso was able to beat Esteban Ocon and actually overtake him on track around lap 41, managing to finish ahead of him at the end of the Grand Prix after that controversial start. But in the end, obviously, the press asked Alonso about what happened in this battle, and the Asturian repeated the same thing, that Esteban was too aggressive at the start, but he thought it was fine, because in fact, he emphasized that later on in that Grand Prix, he let him pass since he had a better pace, leaving the matter more or less settled. But Alonso definitely wouldn't forget this. Obviously, he wouldn't forget it, because the battle between the two was quite tough, even though they told the media that everything was fine. They had their two drivers in the middle of a pretty intense battle, with Ocon wanting to finish ahead of Fernando in the drivers' standings, while Alpine wasn't interested in that battle since they only wanted to finish ahead of McLaren in the constructors' standings. But while this duel was happening, while this battle was taking place, one of the biggest embarrassments in the history of Formula 1 was about to unfold within the team. And in 2022, Alonso's stay with the team had to be renegotiated since his contract was ending. Fernando Alonso wanted a multi-year contract with the team to secure his place in the top category, but Alpine didn't want to give him that many years. They only wanted to give him a one-year contract, believing that sooner or later age would take a toll on his abilities and having a promising young driver named Oscar Piastri in reserve. A young man who had won Formula 3 and Formula 2 on his first try and who had stayed in 2022 as a reserve driver, where Alpine eventually wanted to promote him to a race seat on the team. But Fernando didn't take this particularly well. But instead of blaming them, he decided to be patient and take a gamble on his team as a small personal revenge he had. The Spaniard agreed, saying he would renegotiate and extend his contract under those terms. Meanwhile, behind their backs, he was negotiating with Aston Martin, who was set to lose Sebastian Vettel as the four-time champion planned to retire from Formula One. During this negotiation, he managed to secure a deal with the British team and signed to compete with Aston Martin in 2023. But this took Alpine completely by surprise, since the team's principal at the time, Otmar Szafnauer, said that he found out through the media that Alonso was going to leave them, and not directly from Fernando. This left them in a rather uncomfortable situation, but they had the young reserve driver Oscar Piastri ready to replace Fernando Alonso. However, behind their backs, McLaren was negotiating with Oscar Piastri to bring him to the team in 2023. And Alpine knew this, because thanks to Fernando's move, they could lose their main driver in a single move, but also their diamond in the rough. The French team had an agreement in place with the Australian driver, which they considered sufficient to respond to Fernando Alonso's departure, with an agreement they announced with great fanfare, stating that Oscar Piastri would replace the two-time world champion for the 2023 season. However, Piastri slammed them on social media with a simple post, saying that he understood that Alpine had announced his signing without his consent and clarified that he was not going to drive for the French team in 2023. All of this obviously because he had an agreement to compete next season with the McLaren team, which was an international humiliation for the Alpine team at the hands of the Australian driver, since jokes, memes, and parodies about all of this flooded the internet from companies, celebrities, and people who simply wanted to take advantage and make fun of this very awkward situation Alpine had gotten themselves into. This situation led Alpine into a legal dispute with McLaren, leaving them even more humiliated and financially worse off. Because the agreement that Oscar Piastri had with Alpine did not exclude the pre-contract that the Australian driver signed with McLaren, and before the FIA's contract recognition board, the French team lost against the British team. So, maybe without knowing it, or maybe he did, Alonso ended up getting his way. He secured a spot with the Aston Martin team for 2023, which had a lot of potential, and he got his little revenge with all the scandal that arose around Oscar Piastri and his not being signed by Alpine. You already know how things were with the French team. Publicly humiliated by two drivers with serious competitiveness and reliability problems, and far from that promised position of being able to challenge for wins sooner or later. However, there was still a pretty important issue that needed to be resolved within this structure. Yes, Alonso would leave the team, but he wouldn't want to leave being beaten by Esteban Ocon, and obviously Ocon wasn't going to miss the chance to chalk up this win for himself. Both of them tried to win in every battle they had, but reliability especially hit Alonso hard, as he had to retire from the Italian, Singapore, and Mexican Grands Prix. Ocon did experience these issues, but less frequently, with only one costly retirement at the Singapore Grand Prix, where he was on track to earn good points for himself and the team. Arriving in Brazil, the penultimate round of the season, only 11 points separated the two drivers, with Esteban Ocon ahead. But a good result at this circuit in Brazil, and the Asturian could turn the situation around and beat him in the drivers' standings. But precisely that tension, and all the times they had intense confrontations, would lead us to cross all kinds of limits and completely break the dynamic and the relationship between the two.
He's on the inside, Fernando Alonso is waiting, Esteban Ocon is on the inside of his teammate, forcing Fernando Alonso to take notice.
In a risky move, Ocon leaves Alonso with no space, who almost loses control of the car. And in that maneuver, he ended up damaging his teammate's side pod, which ultimately caused him to lose performance. But then on the main straight, Alonso tries to attack him again. Ocon makes a slight move to cover the inside, and that catches Alonso by surprise, causing him to hit Ocon and break his front wing. And now, at this point, after this battle, both of them had damage to their cars. It's just that Alonso would have to pit, ruining his sprint, and the stewards penalized him with 5 seconds for this action. Meanwhile, Esteban Ocon, for his part, because of the damage, couldn't really do anything in this Grand Prix. He just kept falling back and losing positions. So both drivers ended up without scoring a single point in this sprint race. After this short race, Alonso criticized his teammate, saying that it's always the same when they start together, and that for a while he tried to avoid collisions with Esteban Ocon. But this year, his teammate had already tried to send him into the wall in Jeddah, in Hungary, and now again at this circuit. He even mocked the situation, saying he found it funny because in the end, both cars finished out of the points in that Grand Prix. And when Ocon was asked about this situation, he said he didn't know exactly what had happened. The press mentioned to him what Alonso had said about him, and he simply replied that that was Fernando's opinion, but his was completely different, and that he wasn't responsible for the constant incidents they had because Ocon was always ahead in both maneuvers. Obviously, the French team didn't like this situation at all, and even less so Alonso, who was clearly upset. Fortunately for Alpine, the race went much better than the sprint, but for that, they had to be much more firm, since at a certain point in the race, they even asked Esteban Ocon not to fight against Fernando Alonso. Obviously, considering what had happened the day before, so the few times they met on track, there were no incidents. And Alonso was able to finish in 5th place, while Esteban Ocon was only 8th, cutting into his lead in the standings, and leaving the outcome of this particular duel between the two for the last race of the year at the Abu Dhabi circuit. But unfortunately, that race turned out to be disastrous for Fernando again, since from qualifying Esteban Ocon beat him, qualifying 8th for Sunday's race, with Fernando in 12th position. And in the race he couldn't even fight, since, as usual, his engine ended up breaking down again, causing him to retire once more, causing the engine to quit right then and there. The victory in this particular duel ended up going to Esteban Ocon in the driver's standings, and for the first time in his racing career, the French driver could boast that he had beaten his teammate, and it was none other than a two-time Formula 1 world champion. With this Grand Prix, the battle, and practically the whole war, ended, where Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso went from a relationship of camaraderie and respect to one where sparks flew every time they met on the track. It's not common for midfield teams to have that level of intensity, but Ocon and Fernando took it so far that by the end of 2022, it seemed like the best thing was for both of them to go their separate ways. And yes, it wasn't usual for a midfield team to have that level of intensity, but Esteban Ocon had always been used to taking personal battles with his teammates to that level, as had actually happened with Checo Perez in 2017 and 2018. As I told you, by the end of 2022, both of them would go their separate ways. And look, Guerra in the box always has a clear winner, but this time, this battle was one where you can't really say that both of them lost. But definitely, up to now, none of the three involved can declare themselves a winner. Esteban Ocon stayed with the team, hoping to become the new leader. But they ended up pairing him with someone he hated, Pierre Gasly, with whom he had clashes in the past and in his overwhelming need to destroy his teammates. This ultimately got him fired from the team in 2024 after he nearly ruined Gasly's race in Monaco with an overly aggressive overtake attempt that put him out of the race. And although his journey will continue in 2024 now with the Haas team, he is far from having that opportunity he so desired, with a winning car. On Fernando Alonso's side, although 2023 was a year with many personal successes that allowed him to get on the podium many times that season and show the world that his talent hadn't gone away. Since his first race, Aston Martin kept falling and falling due to performance and competitiveness issues, which to this day keep him far from the dream of the 33rd win. And although the 2026 project with Aston Martin is promising, time is running out for him, and if the car isn't ready to win in 2026, his dream of becoming a three-time world champion and getting the 33rd win will be very hard to achieve. And in the end, he wanted to start winning races, and he dreamed of, sooner or later, fighting for world championships. Against the big names in Formula 1, he ended up firing his team principal and the CEO of his team, Laurent Rossi. And in 2024, they suffered a severe drop in performance, where for much of the year, they had a car at the back of the grid. The disaster reached such a point for the French team that they will even stop being engine suppliers in 2026, going from being a constructor team with all the prestige that entails to simply becoming another customer team on the grid. So this war in the garage didn't benefit anyone at all, and one way or another, everyone ended up losing something. The one who seems to be in the best position so far is Fernando Alonso, if the Aston Martin project pays off in 2026. But as I told you, this particular battle doesn't have any clear winner, but there is a small victory that everyone can brag about at this point. Alpine managed to return to victory, something they hadn't seen in a long time, along with Esteban Ocon's first win in 2021. And Fernando Alonso not only managed to get that podium in Qatar, but his performance throughout his entire stay with the French team allowed him to show the world that his level is still there, and that opened the door for him to join the Aston Martin team as soon as he had the opportunity. They are small victories, of course, and only time will tell who gets closer to the overall win in this duel. But at least, for now and today, none of the three involved is in a very clear position, being a Guerra NL box that practically served only for the ego of one person. And ladies and gentlemen, with this we finish another chapter of Guerra NL Box, the series that, as I have mentioned, we make in collaboration with our friends from NL Paddock. But this is where I ask you, what did you think of this battle? Did you watch it live? Are you just learning about it now? Who would you say is the winner of this particular duel? Or do you think the battle was blown out of proportion at the time? Let me know all your opinions in the comments section. That's all from me. I'll say goodbye by telling you that if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications so you know when I'm uploading a new video, and share this with your friends. I also want to take this opportunity to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. May you spend it with much happiness in the company of your loved ones, and we hope you enjoyed this new episode of Guerra NL Box. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.